Good evening, everyone. Tonight we begin with the quiet footsteps of a queen that history once tried to erase. Imagine this: at just 12 years old, you're sent to a foreign country. Not for summer school, but to marry a king twice your age in a cold castle filled with strangers. Sounds like a fairy tale. Don't dream too quickly. This story is more of a royal tragedy full of schemes, betrayal, and a royal love triangle that would put any modern reality show to shame. Tonight, we'll follow the turbulent journey of Isabella of France, a young girl who became a queen caught between war power and a husband enamored with music, jewels, and other men. If you ever thought being a queen was a dream life, trust me, you wouldn't survive it. And before you start getting comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, only if you truly enjoy what I share here. Don't forget to leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always find it fascinating to know who's awake with me across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some soft background noise, and let's step into tonight's journey together. Put yourself in Isabella's shoes, barely past the age of porridge and lullabies, and already wrapped in layers of heavy silk, seated on a cold throne in a misty kingdom, beside a husband who wouldn't even glance your way. That king, Edward VI, had everything a queen should avoid: brooding good looks, a passion for men, and zero interest in ruling. You weren't just neglected, you were replaced by a nobleman with a taste for fashion more extravagant than your own. And no, this isn't an Elizabethan comedy. This is real life, and you're being forced to play the leading role. Edward II once stunned the entire court by letting his lover, Piers Gaveston, wear the Queen's own wedding jewelry at the coronation. They said Gaveston walked into the ceremony like he was the goddess Mars in a Shakespearean opera. And you, as the official queen, could only sit there keeping your face from cracking with shock so as not to ruin the royal banquet. A strange twist: Isabella, still a teenager, was remarkably diplomatic. No one teaches you how to survive a medieval love triangle, but Isabella managed. You smiled on cue. You even tried to befriend your rival. Maybe you've done that too, trying to keep the peace in a group where you were the outsider. Historians still argue over one thing: did Isabella truly accept her husband's relationship with Gaveston? Or was she quietly planning something bigger? Some believe she had the foresight to realize that a queen's position was secured through patience. Others think her tolerance was only a mask, hiding a storm gathering inside. And then Gaveston was killed. Not by the queen, but by nobles enraged by the king's blatant favoritism. You, Isabella, were pregnant at the time. Maybe you grieved, maybe you felt relieved. Either way, the child you gave birth to became a new hope. From forgotten queen, you became the mother of the heir, a position no one could dismiss. A bit of irony here: in royal circles back then, the only way to earn respect was to give birth. Talent, intelligence, endurance. Sorry, not on the desired skills list at the time. But don't think your life turned a new page just yet. After Gaveston came a new figure, Hugh Despenser. Not as charming, not quite a lover, but certainly your enemy. He saw you as a threat, and unlike Gaveston, Hugh played politics like chess, and you were the queen he intended to remove. So you were isolated. Your assets were seized. Your children taken away. Some records even suggest Hugh abused you, physically and emotionally. Historians don't agree on the specifics, but what's clear is that you were pushed to the edge. And then came your chance, a conflict between England and your homeland, France. You volunteered to be the envoy, and the king agreed. The greatest mistake of the arrogant is to believe others have surrendered. You left England, but not alone. You took with you anger, intelligence, and a plan no one saw coming. In France, you met Roger Mortimer, a knight in exile and perhaps the first person who truly listened to you. The two of you shared a love for literature, art, and a common hatred: Edward II and Hugh Despenser. Some say it was true love. Others believe it was a political alliance disguised as romance. But perhaps at that moment you didn't care. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, you were allowed to be human, not just a queen. A little-known detail: Isabella was not only strategic. She knew how to bargain with marriage alliances. She arranged for her son to be betrothed to the daughter of a powerful lord in the Low Countries, now the Netherlands, in exchange for troops and funding to return to England, not as a captive, but as a liberator. Not bad for a girl once forgotten at her own wedding feast. When you, Isabella, returned to England with your son and a formidable army, you faced no resistance. The people were tired of a weak king and his parasitic favorite. You marched into the heart of England like a changing wind. And for the first time, they called you the she-wolf of France, the queen of liberation. You never wore the crown, but you overthrew an anointed king. No woman had ever done that in England. It was a scandal in both religious and political circles. Many said, she is the embodiment of sin. But others whispered, she is proof of the quiet strength of women who have been dismissed. Oh. And if you're wondering what happened to the deposed king, well, no one officially confessed. Just terrifying rumors about a red-hot iron rod and a silent death in the night. Don't worry, I won't go into detail at bedtime. This is still a program meant to lull you to sleep, not give you nightmares. But as you can see, even in ancient courts, truth is often buried beneath layers of ceremony, glory, and lies. Take a soft breath, we're only halfway through. Ahead still lies a royal life, Isabella's final years, from the she-wolf of France to the gentle grandmother by the fireside. But that will be for later. Are you still awake or already drifting? Don't worry, I'm still here to continue the story. And then you, Isabella, became the most powerful woman in England without wearing a crown. You ruled without official title, but no one dared challenge you. Officially, you were regent for your son, young King Edward III, still too young to rule. But everyone knew the true power belonged to you and your lover, Roger Mortimer. At that moment, you might have thought, at last, it's my turn. After years of betrayal, humiliation, and being a decorative figure on the throne, you now held the power to determine the fate of those who once looked down on you. And yes, you spent money, like a true queen. An odd little fact few know: you once appeared at a ceremony in a silver gown, embroidered with 300 rubies and 800 pearls, crowned with a golden laurel wreath. That wasn't the outfit of a widow retreating from politics. It was a quiet declaration: I'm back and am the main character. The problem was the same people who once cheered for you now began to shudder. They no longer saw a heroine, but someone new, just as vain, just as power-hungry, just as lavish as Edward II before. The people began to whisper, and the nobles showed open discontent. They hadn't forgotten that you were French, foreign, dangerous, and now sitting atop their treasure. Historians still debate this period. Some say you were manipulated by Mortimer. Others claim you were so intoxicated by power that you became no different from your former husband. Perhaps both are partly true. And then your son, Edward III, came of age. The boy who once hid behind your skirts had grown tall, resolute, and increasingly resentful of being treated like a puppet. At 17 in age, when many today are still playing video games and sleeping in, Edward was quietly planning a coup against his own mother. One night, the young man and 23 loyal knights slipped through a stone tunnel beneath Nottingham Castle. No one expected it. You and Mortimer were resting, perhaps feeling safe for the first time in years, and then the doors burst open. You pleaded with your son to spare Mortimer. My son, have mercy on this gentle soul. But Edward was unmoved. Mortimer was tried for treason, hanged at Tyburn. Fortunately, Edward spared him from being drawn and quartered like your husband once did to his enemies. A touch of mercy, though, still sleep-deprived. As for you, you weren't executed. Your son, though furious, still loved his mother. Publicly, you were portrayed as Mortimer's victim, a woman misled, not to blame. Perhaps a wise political move for condemning you would mean the crown had killed its own queen mother. And England wasn't ready for that kind of PR scandal. You were placed under lighthouse arrest for a short time, then granted a generous allowance. You had a castle servant's jewelry, just no power. Your role shifted from she-wolf of France to the cheerful dowager queen attending tea parties and playing with grandchildren. A touching detail later in life, you lived with your youngest daughter Joan, who had left her husband. Yes, another failed royal marriage. And the two of you seemed to find a bit of late peace. You loved your grandchildren, especially the children of Mortimer. And you even convinced your son to restore honor to Mortimer's family name. You remained a fashion icon into your 60s, frequently attending state ceremonies. But inside, perhaps you still thought of those early years, just 12, sitting on a throne beside a man who never loved you. Your life was a sequence of roles: maiden forgotten wife, mother of an heir, usurper of kings, lover of an exile, and finally a grandmother in a shimmering robe, telling stories by the fire. And when you pass it at age 63, you left behind a legacy unlike any woman before you. You were buried at the Franciscan Abbey in London as you wished. In your coffin, they placed the headdress you wore on your wedding day. And one more item, silent, symbolic, the heart of your husband, Edward II, preserved in a small box placed beside you. No one knows who ordered it. Was it you? Your son, a symbol of forgiveness, or the final irony in the paradoxical life of a forgotten queen? And dear listener, if you're still awake, perhaps you're wondering, why did I never hear this story in history class? Here's the truth. History isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's rewritten by those who dislike smart, strong, power-seeking women. Isabella of France was called a she-wolf, but if you look closely at her story, perhaps she was simply a woman forced to become a wolf in a forest full of foxes. But perhaps what keeps Isabella of France's story echoing through time isn't just the royal turmoil, it's how she challenged the limits her era placed on women. Think about it, what was expected of a woman in the 14th century: to be gentle, obedient, silent, to marry, bear children, and endure. She was not allowed to rule, not allowed to question, not allowed to love anyone but her husband, and above all, not allowed to fight back. But Isabella did all of that. A woman who stepped beyond the role society had assigned her, not with weapons or sorcery, but with intellect and resilience. Historians still debate, was Isabella truly the she-wolf of France, as chroniclers described? Or was she simply a woman who saw injustice and refused to be devoured by it? Some medieval texts, often written by male clergy and noblemen, portrayed her as a symbol of chaos, proof that when women enter politics, kingdoms fall. But today, many scholars view Isabella with more empathy, as a woman who used the only power she had to survive and reshape her destiny. It's worth remembering Isabella was not a revolutionary. She didn't rise to fight for women's rights. She didn't pen manifestos or call for reform. But her choices, the way she dared to love, to strategize, to overthrow an anointed king, set a precedent that a woman in the most desperate of times could shift the balance of power. And not just once, but live through it. In that era, that alone was a miracle. One small detail often overlooked after her fall from power: Isabella wasn't executed, burned as a witch, or locked in a convent until death. Instead, she lived in comfort near her children, treated kindly by her son. Perhaps that was the greatest difference between her and the men she had defeated. She knew when to let go. You see, true strength doesn't just lie in seizing power, but in knowing how to release it with grace. And Isabella, though once called a traitor, a seductress, a usurper, proved that with her life. Let's put history aside for a moment. Have you ever wondered who Isabella would be if she lived today? Perhaps a cold-blooded CEO of a multinational corporation, or a shrewd politician who enters the chamber with a half-smile that unnerves everyone, or maybe just a single mother who has fallen, risen, and endured long enough to raise a child destined to lead. History, after all, is a mirror to the present. Through Isabella's story, you might see yourself someone who has been underestimated, pushed aside, forced to play nice just to survive. But then at some point you realize you weren't born to be the background in someone else's story. And you change, without permission. A curious anecdote: in her final years, Isabella became fascinated with astrology and geometry. They say she spent many nights watching the stars and decoding ancient geometric diagrams, whether to find the meaning of life or simply for solace after a stormy past, we'll never know. But the image of a queen who once shook an empire, now quietly counting stars by her window, still stirs the heart because it feels human. You too may have been there. You've fought, argued, hurt. And one day you just sit quietly by the lamplight, staring out the window, wanting peace. No more battles, just rest. If tonight, hearing this, your heart feels a little lighter, then maybe you found a piece of yourself in the woman once called a she-wolf. Not because you share her status or power, but because you too have endured. You too have resisted. And you too have risen. History does not belong to the perfect. It belongs to those who dare to rewrite their fate, even in scribbles and tears, or sometimes in a long sigh in the dark. So let yourself breathe easy now. No crown needed, no audience, just the knowledge that you too have lived through the dynasties of your own life and you are still here. But to truly understand where Isabella Steele came from, we must turn back the clock all the way to late 13th century France. To the place where she was born, raised, and learned the art of royal survival. Because you see, not everyone can grow up as the daughter of one of the coldest kings in Europe and still keep their head. Isabella's father was King Philip IV of France, or as he was known at court with a name that sounds like a medieval wine connoisseur, Philippe le Bel or Philip the Fair. That's right. This king was famous for being handsome. But don't let that chiseled Gothic statue face fool you. Beneath that striking exterior was a soul just as stone cold, stern, calculating, and frugal to the last coin. If you imagine a man who could count tax revenues while plotting his next military campaign, that was Isabella's father. Philippe was the kind of man whose entrance made the room drop 10 degrees, not because he had air conditioning, but because no one dared to breathe too loudly. He didn't smile much, didn't joke, and when he said, "I'm disappointed," it usually meant someone was about to lose their head. One of the most notorious events of Philippe's reign was the crackdown on the Knights Templar. These knights, once revered like medieval TikTok stars, protected pilgrims and held the church's treasury until Philippe accused them of heresy, homosexuality, and bizarre pagan rituals that still sound questionable today. Historians still debate whether these accusations were real or just part of a brilliant debt-erasing scheme from a cash-strapped king. Because you see, the Knights Templar were rich. And Philippe was royally broke, meaning he had palaces but also piles of debt. So he spread the word that they were dangerous, had them arrested, tortured, burned at the stake, and seized all their assets. Let's call it moralized financial optimization. And what do you think the daughter of a man like that grew up to be? Isabella, though the youngest and only daughter, was not pampered. She was taught that tears were weakness, that power came from emotional control, and that men might love you, but the throne would never lie. She learned how to observe, how to stay silent at the right time, and how to survive the daily political chessboard her father arranged. And what about Isabella's mother? She was Jeanne Laboy of Navarre, a queen in her own right. Sharp, intelligent, and according to chroniclers, round. Not obese, but not slim enough to be painted on an altar panel. Not that it mattered. Jeanne was the kind of woman who, if born today, would run a company, drop off her kids at ballet, and campaign for mayoral before dinner. She ruled Navarre independently, helped govern France, and still managed to keep her husband at home every night, not an easy feat. Isabella grew up under two distinct influences from her father, discipline, ruthlessness, and strategy. From her mother pride, dignity, and keen intellect, it's no surprise she became one of the most enigmatic women in European history, a person who could smile charmingly before the court while secretly plotting to overthrow her husband. An interesting detail few noticed: the house of Philippe IV wasn't just intense, it was also quite messy. Isabella's 3 older brothers all became kings of France, and each was entangled in sex scandals. The most infamous, the Tour de Nestlé affair, when 2 of Isabella's sisters-in-law were caught committing adultery and thrown in prison. Who discovered and reported the scandal? Isabella. That's right, the young princess visited home and happened to catch her sisters-in-law not exactly upholding royal decorum. Some say Isabella did it out of loyalty to her father. Others say she simply didn't like anyone breaking the rules unless it was her. Whatever the case, Isabella was the perfect product of a strict royal education, a tangled web of family politics, and an extraordinary ability to adapt. Because imagine this: at 12 years old, trained to become a queen, sent off to England to marry only to discover your husband not only doesn't love you, but openly adores another man right at your own wedding. And still you smile. Still you play the role of perfect daughter-in-law, the noble French princess. That, dear listener, is the pinnacle of emotional control. So if today you're feeling drained after a Zoom meeting where no one unmuted their mic, just remember, Isabella sat through an entire royal wedding where her rival wore her bridal jewels and she still kept her noble composure. Take a deep breath. You don't need to be born royal to learn how to be strong like a queen. But knowing Isabella's roots and the people who shaped her helps you understand that resilience isn't always innate. Sometimes it comes from growing up in a palace where your father was both handsome and burning people alive to clear his debts. To understand why a 12-year-old girl like Isabella of France was sent to England to marry a stranger, we must step into the cold, calculated world of medieval politics, where love was a luxury and marriage was a strategic move. In the early 14th century, Europe wasn't a peaceful travel map. It was a giant chessboard where monarchs constantly fought for land influence and pride. The 2 dominant powers were the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of England. You can think of them as 2 wealthy, powerful, and endlessly petty neighbors. Between them stretched long-standing tensions over territory, most notably the region of Gascony in southern France, which was then under English control due to earlier conquests. To avoid war, at least temporarily, the 2 sides agreed to sign a peace treaty. But back then, treaties couldn't just be sealed with signatures, they needed to be sealed with royal blood. And as usual, the one chosen to become the living seal of this agreement was a princess, not yet through puberty, Isabella, the only daughter of King Philip IV of France. That's right, Isabella wasn't asked. There was no introduction, no royal version of Tinder, just her father's command, a heavy wedding gown, and a sea voyage to England. For that little girl, the future wasn't a fairy tale, it was a diplomatic contract with herself as collateral. Picture it, 12 years old, learning embroidery, reciting poetry, and nibbling almond pastries in a Parisian castle, suddenly placed into a carriage, then onto a ship to a foreign land, where her husband was a newly crowned king known for his indifference to women. And upon arrival, Isabella wasn't greeted with roses or wine. Instead, she witnessed her husband lavish public affection on another man, Piers Gaveston, even going so far as to have him wear her bridal jewels during the coronation. But why Isabella? Why was Philip IV's daughter the chosen piece on this political board? Because Philip wasn't just any king. He was shrewd in diplomacy and ruthless in strategy. He knew that by marrying Isabella to Edward II, he could not only ease tensions between the 2 kingdoms, but also place a noble spy in the heart of England. Isabella would be the daughter of the French king, the wife of the English king, and the mother of the future heir to the English throne. It was the perfect move, 3 layers of influence secured through one child. Moreover, Isabella was considered the crown jewel of the French royal family. Beautiful, intelligent, and capable of maintaining regal composure, even while deeply wounded, she was not just a princess, but a living diplomatic symbol. Her becoming Queen of England would elevate the international status of both kingdoms, at least on paper. However, precisely because she was a beautiful chess piece, Isabella had no choice. Her marriage was not built on emotion. No one asked, "Do you agree to marry Edward?" There were only political nods and oaths exchanged between lords. Isabella, like many princesses of her time, was forced to live for the interests of the state, not for her own happiness. And the irony is, though she entered marriage as a diplomatic asset, Isabella refused to live like a forgotten object. Beneath the silk and silent gazes, she watched. She learned. She endured. And then, after nearly 2 decades, she flipped the board. But going back to the beginning, Isabella came to England for peace between 2 kingdoms, for strategic placement in royal politics, and because she was a useful tool in the hands of a powerful father. Philippe IV, the man who had burned the Knights Templar alive to erase debts and seize their assets, the king whose advisors claimed he could read a man's soul with a single glance, chose his daughter as the strongest piece to strike at the heart of his opponent. As for Isabella, perhaps as she stood before the sea veil, heavy with gold in hand, she had no idea that fate was about to throw her into a life like no other. A life people would both condemn and admire, curse and retell endlessly. And if while lying there listening, you find yourself thinking, "That's so unfair to that little girl," then you've begun to grasp something of that era. A time when women were chosen, not choosing. And yet a time when a rare few like Isabella dared to choose, back in the most unexpected of moments. Philippe didn't stop there. By 1306, as finances continued to shrink, he targeted another group, the Jews. Not only did he expel the entire Jewish population from France, he also confiscated their property, canceled the debts they had lent, and called it a national purification. A move both brutal and calculated, which left a dark stain on France's history. Modern historians still debate whether it was motivated by religion, racism, or simply money. Philippe even did what few European kings dared: challenge the supreme authority of the Pope. After clashing with Pope Boniface VIII, he maneuvered to have his own candidate installed as the new Pope, and then invited the entire papal court to move from Rome to Avignon, France. Thus began a nearly 70-year period during which the Pope lived and ruled in France, an unprecedented chapter in church history, often referred to as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. And amidst all this calculation, reform, and violence, Philippe remained the father of 4 children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. All 3 sons eventually became kings after him, and all died young, some without heirs. Rumors spread that the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, before being burned alive, had cursed Philippe and his bloodline. And indeed, just a few years later, Philippe died suddenly at age 46 in a hunting accident, and his Capetian dynasty quickly plunged into a succession crisis. His only daughter, Isabella, was married off to England to secure peace between the 2 kingdoms. And as you've already heard, her story was hardly more peaceful. But what made Philippe a memorable figure in history was the way he transformed France from a patchwork of feudal fiefdoms into a centralized monarchy, laying the groundwork for France's rise in the centuries to come. He was not beloved. He was not a benevolent king. But he was a man all of Europe had to fear. And if you're still awake, eyes open in the dark, maybe you're thinking what I am: sometimes history isn't made by the best people, but by the most relentless ones. So, Isabella left France carrying more than a wedding gown, a chest of jewels, and a gilded veil. She also carried the iron discipline of her father, King Philippe IV. But upon arriving in England as the new queen wife of Edward II, she quickly realized this kingdom was nothing like what she knew in Paris. If her father's France was a machine of order run by strict laws and cold strategy, Edward II's England was more like a carriage missing a wheel. Edward II had just ascended the throne after the death of his father, Edward Ione, of the fiercest warriors in English history, known as Longshanks for his height and the Hammer of the Scots for his love of pounding Scotland. That father was the model of a medieval king, tough, commanding, and unafraid of bloodshed. Edward II, well, the opposite. The new king loved music, art, embroidery, and was especially enamored with a nobleman named Piers Gaveston. Their relationship wasn't just rumor, it was a public storm. At the wedding to Isabella, King Edward not only ignored his bride, but gave all the lavish French dowry gifts to Gaveston. And when the court was scandalized by the insult, Edward casually seated Gaveston beside him at the wedding feast, wearing Isabella's wedding jewels to shine. Imagine this. You're a French princess raised on precision etiquette and a social hierarchy as strict as a Bach fugue. Then you're imported into a court where your husband not only disregards you, but turns the royal stage into a spectacle glorifying his lover. Politically, England wasn't faring much better. Edward II had little talent for governance. He delegated power to Gaveston, ignored the great barons, and defied the church. The result: the feudal lords were furious, no longer recognizing the king as a central authority. The barons began maneuvering to limit royal power, forming their own councils, even issuing ultimatums to banish Gaveston from court. Historians still debate, did Isabella remain silent in those early years because she was too young, or was she quietly watching and calculating? Either way, at just 14, she became pregnant with her first child, Edward III. Giving birth to an heir temporarily solidified her position. But that didn't mean happiness. After Gaveston was captured and executed by the nobles dramatically, and with deep resentment, Isabella thought she might finally claim her rightful place. But no, the void Gaveston left was quickly filled by another man, even more dangerous, Hugh Despenser. If Gaveston was a lover of luxury, Despenser was a predator of power. It's unclear whether he and the king had a romantic relationship or a shared obsession with control. But one thing is certain, he saw Isabella as a threat. And he didn't hesitate to eliminate her. The English court had ceased to be a place of governance and had become a battlefield of manipulation, jealousy, and psychological warfare. Despenser controlled. Edward pushed Isabella aside, isolated her, confiscated her lands, seized her property, even took her children to raise under his control. Some records suggest Despenser may have abused Isabella physically as well as politically. She was no longer a queen but a prisoner in her own castle. Meanwhile, England was in chaos. The nobility hated the king. The church opposed the relationship between Edward and Despenser. Peasants suffered from bad weather, crop failures, and famine. But the king remained intoxicated with power and blinded by his lover. A rarely told story, in 1322, Edward II took Isabella with him on a military campaign to Scotland. But after losing the battle and with the enemy closing in, he abandoned Isabella in a fortress and fled with Despenser. Imagine how she felt upon hearing the news left behind, with war raging, servants slaughtered, and her two closest companions killed. Perhaps in that moment, something inside the betrayed queen shattered. And when she returned alive, faced with her husband's blank gaze, told she must swear loyalty to Despenser in order to see her children. She didn't protest. She didn't cry. She simply nodded. But deep inside, a plan was taking root. A new move was being prepared. England was like a silent storm, a kingdom that no longer trusted its king. A queen pushed to the edge. And in that darkness, Isabella, the once celebrated diplomatic flower of France, would do the unthinkable, not only overthrow a king, but force history to rewrite itself. And so, after years of being suppressed, insulted, and pushed to the bottom of her role, Isabella was no longer the shy French princess she once was. In silence, she transformed into a master strategist, not on a board of ebony and ivory, but on the political chessboard of an entire realm. When Edward II and Despencer believed they had broken her spirit, when they stripped her of land allowance and even her children, they didn't realize they had created a storm hiding beneath silk. Isabella didn't explode with rage. She didn't slam tables like a Shakespearean queen. No. She nodded. She said yes. She requested to be sent to France as an envoy to help negotiate over the disputed territory of Gascony. And that was the first step in turning the tide. Edward thought she had submitted. Despencer believed she was tamed. But the moment she reached French soil, Isabella never looked back. She shed her role as a pawn and began to construct a new Bourdon where she was no longer a piece, but the player. She wrote back to her husband requesting that their son, Prince Edward, then 13, come to France to pay homage to his uncle, the King of France. In a moment of sheer foolishness, Edward II agreed. And just like that, Isabella had the ace in her hand, the heir to the English throne. No one imagined she would use her own son to legitimize a rebellion. Then, at the French court, Isabella met Roger Mortimer, an English noble who had been exiled and persecuted by Despencer. He was clever, charismatic, tactically skilled, and importantly shared Isabella's hatred of Edward II. Their relationship began as a political alliance. But according to chronicles, love quietly blossomed between two people broken by courtly cruelty. And you know what? In an age that saw women as soft, powerless, Isabella and Mortimer orchestrated a coup so bold that many later doubted it was even real. They persuaded William the Count of Hainaut, now in the Netherlands, to lend them troops. In return, Isabella promised to marry her son, the future King of England, to William's daughter, a diplomatic marriage crafted to raise funds and armies for a rebellion against the bridegroom's father. So in 1326, Isabella, Mortimer, and young Edward sailed to England with 100 ships filled with mercenaries, French banners, and the furious heart of a defiant queen. Strangely, they met no resistance. The people were done with Edward II. By the time Isabella landed, local forces joined her. Nobles, merchants, and soldiers all realized she hadn't come to conquer. She had come to rescue England from a rotting throne. They called her the Queen of Liberation. Edward II and Despencer panicked and fled London. In the rush to gather gold and flee, they revealed their true selves, not rulers, but cowards. They were captured in Wales. Edward was deposed. Despencer was put on trial for treason, with a punishment too gruesome to describe here, so you can sleep peacefully tonight. With her husband dethroned and his lover executed, Isabella established a regency government in the name of her son, King Edward III, only 14 years old. And thus, from a woman erased from every meeting, stripped of all power and honor, Isabella rebuilt herself from the shards of humiliation. She became the only person in English history to depose an anointed king without a royal army or a crown. You see, her plan didn't begin with swords or shields. It began with silence, patience, the endurance of being underestimated, and a moment ripe enough to say, enough. If you're still awake, perhaps you're wondering how far can a woman go when there's nothing left to take from her. The answer lies in tonight's story. Close your eyes. Let the winds of history brush softly past your ear, and know that in any era, when a woman has been silent for too long, it is often the moment she begins rewriting destiny with her own hands. But power, as you know, is always a double-edged sword. And although Isabella achieved a glorious victory, the path that followed was far from paved in roses. On the contrary, it was a slippery journey, where the gleam of triumph quickly turned into the heavy shadow that haunts any woman who dares to touch power. After the historic overthrow, Isabella did not claim the throne. She allowed her son Edward III to ascend at age 14 and declared she would serve as regent until he came of age. It sounded proper, reasonable, even maternal. But everyone knew she was the true ruler, and beside her, none other than Roger Mortimer, lover, comrade, and now unofficial co-ruler. They lived like a royal couple without a title. But with everything else, control over the royal treasury appointments to high office decisions on foreign and domestic affairs, all passed through their hands. They wore golden embroidered robes, jeweled crowns, and lived in lavish castles once owned by convicted nobles. From a revolutionary alliance, Isabella and Mortimer now resembled a version 2.0 of the very regime they had toppled. And that began to stir unrest. The barons who once praised Isabella as a savior now whispered, "Is she really better than Edward II?" The people murmured about her extravagance while they remained hungry. Scholars, clergy, and even nobles grew uneasy watching Mortimer act more and more like a de facto king, despite having no royal blood, and more importantly, no legitimacy. Modern historians still debate, was Isabella drunk on victory or simply tasting for the first time the allure of power she'd been denied for the first 20 years of her life. Some defend her, claiming she sought only to protect her son from courtly infighting. Others accuse her of being an ambitious woman who let her lover seize the throne out of boundless greed. But from any angle, one cannot deny the regency of Isabella, and Mortimer began to resemble a two-person dictatorship. They punished rivals, executed nobles, confiscated estates, appointed loyalists to power, and forgot that the boy who had once been 14 was now 17. Edward III, though outwardly obedient, was quietly observing it all. And just as his mother had once overthrown his father, now Edward was quietly making his own plan. On an October night in 1330, Edward III and a group of loyal knights crept into Nottingham Castle through a hidden tunnel. They burst into the bedchamber of his mother, and Mortimer went with rage, but with a cold resolve to end the shadow reign. Isabella, upon seeing her son, broke into tears. She pleaded for Mortimer's life. "My son, have mercy on this gentle man." But Edward did not waver. Roger Mortimer was arrested, tried, and executed for treason. Not drawn and quartered, Edward was more merciful than his grandfather. But still, it was a shameful end for the man once known as the Queen's right hand. And Isabella, surprisingly, Edward did not imprison his mother, nor humiliate her publicly. Instead, she was sent to live in a modest castle with a royal pension, personal attendants, court musicians, and her beloved hobbies, astrology and reading. She lost her power, but not her son's respect, a rare grace few kings ever grant to the mother who deposed their father. She lived 28 more years after her fall, gradually becoming a peaceful figure close to her grandchildren, especially her youngest daughter Joan, who herself endured a failed royal marriage. Isabellon's the she-wolf of France, now an elderly grandmother with silver hair, strolling through gardens, reminiscing about court life, and perhaps remembering Mortimer. When she died at age 63, she requested to be buried at the Franciscan Abbey in London, wearing the headdress she had worn on her wedding day. And most strangely of all, in her coffin was placed a small box containing the heart of Edward II, the husband she had once overthrown. No one knows for certain whether it was her decision or her son's. Was it a gesture of forgiveness, a symbol of eternal royal union, or merely fate's final ironic twist? The answer was likely buried with her. But one thing is certain, Isabella was never a footnote in history. She was the embodiment of pain cast to the margins, of resilience, when there was nothing left to lose, and of a woman who dared to do what the world told her she could not rule. If you're still awake now, perhaps you understand why this story isn't just about a distant queen, but about anyone who's ever been silenced, cast aside, and then one day rose up and made the world listen. And when the lights of the court no longer shone upon Isabella, a new brilliance began to rise from the very son she had borne, protected and later opposed Edward III. You might think, after all that chaos, rebellion, execution, and deposition within his own family, the young man would grow into a broken king in need of weekly therapy. But no. Edward III, instead of being crushed by the legacy of his parents, became one of the greatest and longest reigning monarchs in English history. From the moment he overthrew Mortimer, Edward revealed his exceptional character. At just 17, he did not falter. He acted decisively, but not with cruelty. He executed his mother's lover, but not his mother. He reclaimed the throne, but didn't humiliate the woman who gave him life. In a court accustomed to solving problems with the axe, Edward chose firmness with restraint. A remarkable quality for a teenage boy, especially in an age without TikTok to vent. Once he held full power, Edward set about rebuilding the kingdom. He cleansed the court of Mortimer's loyalists, returned lands to faithful nobles, and most of all, restored the dignity of a crown badly tarnished by his father. It was a grueling task, but Edward had inherited his mother's political shrewdness and his grandfather, Edward's fierce sense of duty. The defining moment of Edward III's reign. The longest war Europe had ever seen, the 100 Years' War. Yes, you heard right, not the weekend skirmish or the August conflict, but a war that lasted an actual century between England and France, sparked by something seemingly simple. Edward believed he had the right to the French throne. Why? Because Edward's mother Isabella was the daughter of King Philippe IV of France. And when the Capetian line in France died out, meaning no more eligible male heirs, Edward said, "Well, I'm the legitimate grandson, hand over the crown." The French replied with a firm, "Sorry, but women can't pass down the royal crown here. You're out." And thus, war broke out. From there, Edward III took on the role of a warrior king, not just sitting on a throne, but riding into battle, wearing armor, wielding a sword, and striking fear into his enemies. At the Battle of Carcy, 1346, Edward defeated the French despite being heavily outnumbered. It was the first major use of the longbow by the English, a weapon that wiped out French cavalry like candles in the wind. While earlier kings often died of disease, assassination, or falling off a horse, while hunting, Edward III lived healthily into his 60s and impressive age, for a time when onion soup could be fatal if the onions weren't properly washed. He was also the founder of the Order of the Garter, a prestigious knightly order that the British royal family still upholds today as a supreme symbol of tradition. The emblem of the order, a garter recalling a somewhat comical lost stocking at a party incident that became royal legend. But don't think Edward's life was all victory and glory. He faced heartbreaking tragedies, the death of his beloved wife Philippa of Hainault, followed by the death of his eldest and most gifted son, Edward, known as the Black Prince. And toward the end of his reign, as age and illness crept in, Edward grew frail and was manipulated by courtiers. Meanwhile, the people suffered as the Black Death swept through Europe, killing millions. Edward III died in 1377 after nearly 50 years on the throne. A golden age came to an end, leaving behind a complicated legacy, a heroic king, a son who once rose against his mother, a husband loyal to his wife to the very end, and a monarch who was far from perfect, but utterly unforgettable. If you're still awake by now, perhaps you feel the strange truth, though born of a strategic marriage between a shrewd mother and an irresponsible father, Edward III became living proof that legacy does not dictate destiny. You can emerge from chaos and write a completely new chapter for yourself. And to fully grasp the scope of what Edward III did for England, one must look beyond battle's knightly emblems and glittering coronations. One must look outward to the map. Because true power lies not just on the throne, but in territory and influence. And under Edward III, England was not only more effectively governed, it expanded beyond its borders as never before since the Norman era. When Edward came to the throne in 1327, England was in disarray. His father, Edward II, had been deposed. The royal household was fractured, and territories in France were slipping away. The northern border with Scotland was a constant source of conflict, and domestic systems of administration and taxation were far from unified. England at that time resembled a grand fortress, with crumbling foundations lacking both internal cohesion and external respect. Yet within a few decades, the map of English power changed dramatically. Every frontier, every marker of influence extended further under Edward III's rule, not through a single conquest, but through a long chain of political, military, economic, and diplomatic strategies. First, the territories across the Channel. Since the time of Henry II, England had held lands in France, but by Edward's time most had been lost to the French, save for Gascony. That alone stirred Edward's resolve. Citing his claim to the French throne through his mother, Isabella, Edward declared his right of succession, thus launching the 100 Years' War, one of the longest military conflicts in European history. Though he never claimed the French crown, Edward regained significant territory, most notably Calais. This strategic port city was besieged by English forces for a year before it fell in 1347. Calais would remain under English control for nearly 200 years. It was not just a military win, but a geopolitical foothold that allowed England to maintain influence on the continent, control cross-channel trade, and establish a political corridor between two shores. From a mapmaker's perspective, if you draw a line from Dover in England to Calais in France, you'll see more than just geography. You'll see a thread of power linking island and continent. Calais was not just land. It was a symbol of England's expanding reach. To the north, Edward avoided the protracted campaigns his grandfather had waged. Instead of endless war with Scotland, he used marriage as diplomacy, marrying his daughter Joan to King David II of Scotland. Not long after David was captured in battle and held prisoner in England, Edward didn't kill him. Instead, he kept him as a living political hostage, ensuring border stability and demonstrating English superiority. On the map, this helped solidify the Anglo-Scottish frontier for years, allowing Edward to focus his resources southward, toward France. Even within England itself, the map changed daily under Edward's reign. There were no sweeping military campaigns, but profound administrative reforms reshaped England into something closer to a modern nation. He redrew administrative boundaries, expanded towns, and strengthened the roles of mayors and local officials. Rural areas that had once been loosely governed tax zones became part of a formalized administrative network. Population distribution and urban centers began to emerge more clearly, marking the early steps of English urbanization. Notably, Edward invested in port cities and the navy, something no king before him had seriously attempted. Under his leadership, England began building large warships, reforming port infrastructure, and constructing a navy capable of defending the coastline trade routes and military campaigns in France. These were the first small but firm steps on the path toward becoming a future naval empire. Beyond military and political efforts, Edward also strengthened the local economy. He issued decrees protecting English merchants from foreign competition, encouraged domestic trade, and particularly supported the wool industry, England's top export at the time. Regions such as East Anglia, the Cotswolds, and Yorkshire evolved into manufacturing and trade hubs, forming distinct economic zones on the map, rather than being mere scattered patches of farmland. All of this, Calais captured the Scottish border, stabilized domestic territory, reorganized seaports, developed the economy boosted, meant that Edward III's England was no longer an isolated island kingdom, but a real European power. His map was a map of a kingdom stretching beyond geographic limits, reaching out to the sea and asserting political and commercial influence abroad. If you're still awake and picturing that map in your mind, imagine those borders not just drawn in ink but carved in iron with battle-hardened spirit, and the long-term vision of a king who once grew up caught in a royal love triangle. But despite being a brilliant monarch, a courageous warrior, and a far-sighted builder, Edward III was still a man, a husband, a father, and the center of a royal family full of drama. If politics was the public stage where he etched historical victories, his family was the backstage where he placed his heart, his faith, and at times his deepest pain. Edward married Philippa of Hainault, a political match that blossomed into one of the most enduring and affectionate relationships in English royal history. Philippa was not only a kind queen, but also a true partner. A accompanying him on campaigns, managing logistics, and at times even governing in his stead when the king was away at war. In a world where many kings treated their wives as mere childbearers, Edward showed genuine respect and affection. They were together nearly 40 years, a rarity in that era, and more notably, no major scandals or infidelities were recorded during their marriage. Together they had at least 13 children as a full royal dynasty, almost a football team with a coaching staff. And like every large family, the children of Edward carried a full range of stories: talent, tragedy, rebellion, and fateful curses. The most prominent among them was Edward the Black Prince, the heir to the throne and one of England's legendary warriors. He was called Black, not for his temperament, but perhaps for the dark armor he wore in battle, or simply because his fierce victories earned him a fearsome image. The Black Prince inherited nearly all of his father's finest traits: bravery, intelligence, loyalty, and a natural gift for leadership. He led the English at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where he captured King John II of France and turned the war into legend. Under his father's guidance, the Black Prince was groomed to be the ideal future king until tragedy struck. He contracted a mysterious illness after a campaign in Spain. It lingered for years, slowly weakening him until he died in 1376, just 1 year before King Edward III himself passed away. The death of his beloved son was not just a personal blow, it disrupted the royal succession. The Black Prince was meant to inherit the crown, but he died early, leaving behind a young son of only 10, Richard II. That marked the beginning of the long unraveling of the Plantagenet dynasty, leading to the bloody civil wars, later known as the Wars of the Roses. Because after Edward III and the crown no longer followed ability, it followed disputes, inheritance claims, and political maneuvering. Edward III's other sons had their own tumultuous stories. One son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, played a crucial role during the regency of King Richard II and became the patriarch of the House of Lancaster, of the two major factions in the Wars of the Roses. Another son, Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, became the ancestor of the House of York. Yes, both sides of the Civil War were descendants of Edward III. In other words, he was the common ancestor of both factions who would later fight to the death over the throne for more than half a century. Edward's family, if you look at a genealogical chart, is an ambitious web with the seeds of division. But during his lifetime, he managed to maintain relative unity. His children were well educated, granted clear titles, and strategically married off. That helped stabilize England through the mid-14th century, especially compared to the disarray under Edward II. However, nothing lasts forever. When Philippa died in 1369, Edward III fell into deep depression. He gradually withdrew from governance, his health declined, and his court fell increasingly under the influence of advisors, especially one named Alice Perrers, a young woman believed to be his late-life mistress. She gained great influence at court, but sparked intense resentment among the nobility and was harshly criticized. Edward III died in 1377, more frail and lonely than the radiant king of his youth. His beloved son was gone, his trusted queen had passed, and his surviving sons were already preparing for political games he could no longer control. Still, no one could deny that during his golden years, Edward's family represented a strong, confident, and strategically guided royal house. They were the backbone of brilliant victories and the foundation for a kingdom rising amid a turbulent Europe. If you're still listening, still awake, perhaps you too feel what I feel, that beneath the red robes and golden crowns, these people, kings, queens, princes, also loved, also hurt, also lost like anyone else. The only difference is their stories were inked in black on old parchment and preserved in history books. And if you think that after Edward III's death, England could finally breathe a sigh of relief, you've underestimated the complexity of a royal family. What happened next was like pulling on a sweater knit too tightly. Tug on one thread, and everything starts to come undone. The descendants of Edward III were the roots of a near-century-long civil war, known as the Wars of the Roses. Not because they were incompetent, but because they were too many, too ambitious, and their bloodline more tangled than a wedding bakery's family tree chart. You remember Edward's sons, right? The heroic but ill-fated Black Prince, John of Gaunt, who never intended to be king, but sired a house that thirsted for the crown. Lionel of Antwerp, less famous, but his bloodline would eventually return with a claim to the throne. All those branches split over time into the houses of Lancaster and York. One side said, "We are the rightful heirs of John of Gaunt, the third legitimate son." The other replied, "True, but we descend from Lionel, the second son. Which means by order of birth, our claim is stronger." And just like that, boom, civil war. Now you see why perhaps Edward III should have thought twice before having so many sons. Of course, in his time, Edward couldn't see the future. He only knew he needed to secure succession. And with the Black Prince dying early, it was his young son Richard VI, who was placed on the throne at just 10 years old. Yes, 10 years old. And what were you doing at 10? Probably playing marbles or panicking over a math test. Richard, on the other hand, wore a crown. But don't imagine that crown as light as a feather. It was heavy in both the literal and symbolic sense. Putting a child in charge of a kingdom is like handing a kid the wheel of a truck full of stones. A crash is nearly inevitable. Richard grew up sheltered especially under the care of his uncle John of Gaunt, who held much of the actual power. At first, the kingdom remained relatively stable because the grown-ups were still running things. But as Richard came of age, he began to distance himself from his advisors, becoming arrogant, extravagant, and making decisions that tested the patience of the nobility. And as expected, cracks began to show. John of Gaunt's grandson, Henry Bolingbroke, was exiled by Richard. A move that may have seemed minor, but it was the final straw. Because when John of Gaunt died, Richard confiscated Henry's inheritance. And that was a fatal mistake. Henry Bolingbroke didn't sit idly by. He returned to England, rallied support from the nobility, and overthrew Richard II, establishing a new dynasty, the House of Lancaster, with himself as King Henry IV. That was the turning point, because from then on, Edward III's descendants were officially at war with each other over the crown, and England plunged into a century of chaos. Meanwhile, if you looked at a map of Europe, you'd notice something ironic. While other nations were building stable courts and advancing art and science, England was fighting itself. After Henry IV came Henry the King, behind the great victory at Agincourt. But his son Henry VI became one of the weakest kings in history. He was even deposed twice. During this time, the House of York descendants of Lionel, Edward III's second son, rose up, claiming a more legitimate right to the throne. And so the Wars of the Roses erupted. The red roses, Lancaster, and white roses, York, weren't just poetic symbols. They represented generations of bloodshed, all tracing back to one king, Edward III. A ruler who built a glorious empire, but also planted the seeds of a tangled succession as knotted as a bowl of noodle soup. When you think of Edward's family, what do you see? A king with a loving wife, noble children, and a magnificent legacy. Or a family with far too many qualified contenders, still locked in a headache-inducing succession crisis 100 years later? Perhaps that's the paradox. The greater the dynasty, the larger its shadow, and that very shadow often overwhelms the weaker heirs who get swept up in the storms of history. And you know what? Even as we sit here in the gentle dark, simply listening to a story, there's something deeply human about their tragedy. Everyone wants to be loved, to be seen. But when power enters the room, family bonds are often the first thing put up for negotiation. Are you lying still listening? If If you are, try to imagine you are a child of royal blood, waking each day in a cold stone castle knowing that one day your own relatives might be the ones to push you off the throne. Thankfully, we're just telling bedtime stories. And hopefully, you're not heir to any blood-soaked crown in real life. You know, there's something strange about history. Sometimes things that happened half a millennium ago still shape the way we live today. From how the British choose their monarchs to the chill-sounding name Windsor that the royal family uses now. And if you're lying there quietly with the hum of the fan and the coolness of night around you tonight, he'll tell you how a king named Edward from 700 years ago still echoes into the story of Meghan Markle. Yes, really. The reign of Edward III, with all its glory and tragedy, left a profound imprint on the core of the English monarchy. From his expansion of territory and legal reforms to everything that happened after his death. It was all like a historical domino chain. And when that first domino fell, it didn't just topple a few pieces. It shook the entire political board. First, the Civil War known as the Wars of the Roses. You remember, right? Two sides, the House of Lancaster, Red Rose, and the House of York, White Rose, fighting from 1455 to 1487, 30 years of blood betrayal and cancelled tea parties due to coups. That war ended when Henry Tudor Lancaster defeated Richard III York at the Battle of Bosworth Owen, of the most fateful clashes in English history. Henry took the throne as Henry VII founded the Tudor dynasty, and to prevent future wars, married Elizabeth of York. That wasn't just a wedding. It was a national therapy session. Two enemy bloodlines merged into one, ending the crown dispute by having a baby. And guess what? That baby became King Henry VIII, the man most famous for having more wives than a bakery has savory options. It was this union of Lancaster and York that gave the Tudors power, launching a golden age of culture, art, and politics. Yes, if Edward III hadn't had so many sons, Shakespeare might be selling vegetables today. The second impact, the constitutional monarchy that Britain still holds. After centuries of civil war coups and growing distrust in the divine right of kings, the English learned a hard lesson: no one should have absolute power just because they were born in a palace. So gradually through the Stuarts, Cromwell, the Restoration, and then limiting royal power. Again, the English built a political system where the monarch reigns but does not rule. That means Queen Elizabeth II could wave, but she couldn't declare war on Sweden just because IKEA ran out of stock. And yes, you're reading this right. All these shifts stemmed from the messy succession after Edward III. If the Black Prince hadn't died young, if Richard II hadn't been deposed, if Henry Bolingbroke hadn't returned with an army, England might still be an absolute monarchy like something out of Game of Thrones. Third Edward III's blood still runs through the royal family today. Did you know Queen Elizabeth VI and now King Charles III can trace their lineage back to Edward III? The York and Lancaster lines, after generations of intermarriage, continue to this day a tangled family tree that historians spend lifetimes mapping. Even Prince William and Prince Harry, names you can't avoid in today's tabloids, are distant heirs of that ancient bloody crown dispute. And if you think Harry leaving the royal family was the biggest scandal ever, you might want to revisit that time Isabella overthrew her husband and ruled on behalf of her son. In short, Edward III didn't just shape the 14th century, he planted the seed for a political, cultural, and dynastic tree whose shade still falls over modern Britain. One more influence, often overlooked, the white and red roses from the war, were combined into the Tudor rose, the royal emblem still used today. You can spot it carved on parliament chairs, palace doors, or even on souvenirs at Heathrow Airport. History loves wordplay. And it's ironic that some of the bloodiest moments in England's past are now proudly displayed on teacups and napkins, saying, "This is cultural heritage, not a clearance sale." If you're still listening, still awake in the soft glow of night, with your head tilting gently toward the pillow, then I want you to remember this, no matter how distant the past may seem. It always finds a way to echo into the present. A political marriage, a child who died too young, a king betrayed, and then a dynasty that changed history. Sleep well tonight. And if you find yourself in a dream wearing a crown and riding through fields of red and white roses, just remember not to sign any treaties without reading the fine print on heirs and succession. See you in the next video where we'll uncover the story of a king once labeled the weakest in English history, yet whose legacy still whispers powerful lessons to this day. You won't want to miss it. You won't want to.